Unfortunately, you don't have to work in an adult real world job very long before you notice that a bad team culture will destroy a high performer every single time. The crunch time in the growth of a business is when the founder or founders stop having a direct connection to everybody. It's easy to keep culture tight when everybody responds directly to you, but as the organization scales and you add those levels, the only way forward is to make sure that each leader at each level takes responsibility for that culture to turn it into a high-performing team.
So I'm curious, we talked a little bit before. I've started 8 companies over the years, hired thousands of employees, amazing people to work with, and getting it right with the teams, incredibly important. I always wanted everybody to be the CEO of their own role, really work well together. When we define culture, behaviors we held people accountable to were, one of them was high-performing team members will be fully engaged and participate within the team and go for a personal commitment and result. All of it wasn't for everybody, and that's okay, but we really had a great team. And I'm curious, what got you interested in teams? I mean, you've never really had a business where you hired lots and lots of employees, but somehow you landed on this. What's the high level evolution for you to get here?
Yeah, no, I've definitely been lucky in that the team that I have behind me now is smaller and nimble, and they still all sort of answer to me, right? We'll get into why I think that's so pivotal here in a second. But I came at it, I finished doing my initial dissertation research and all that as an academic, training up to be a professor, was on innovation. And one of the things I think was the biggest kind of misconception where creativity and innovation research had revealed this truth, but common practice was totally different, was around this idea that it's a collaborative thing, right? That we tend to think of these as sort of lone geniuses, et cetera, but the truth is creativity is a team sport. And so that kind of started it, right? It was a really interesting kind of seeded of an idea. And then that led to that research. I started teaching and eventually ended up publishing that research under a book called The Myths of Creativity. The most highlighted sentence in that entire book is creativity is a team sport. But then that led to the next question I was getting from a lot of people is, what makes for a company culture and what are the workplace practices and things like that you need to do to foster creativity and innovation? And then we had to get into really around how do you incentivize collaboration? How do you put teams together, et cetera? And so it was kind of this stumbled into it, but I got 3 different practitioner-oriented books in and about 5 years of work as a researcher, as an academic, before I kind of realized, wait a minute, teamwork and collaboration is the through line through all of this, right? And then culture is that thing that stands behind it, to where I kind of realized, okay, now let's do the deep dive. And so I've been really, really lucky to come at it from an academic perspective where I get to study lots and lots and lots of different teams. And the reason I told you earlier that I'm lucky in that my own team is small and anxious to me, is you probably found this in running your different businesses. The crunch time in the growth of a business is when the founder or founders stop having a direct connection to everybody, right? When you have multiple different levels, you then have to learn not only to have those leaders underneath you, they need to think of your business as, I love your term for it, the CEO of their own little team. They need to think of it as part of my job is to convey that culture. It's easy to keep culture tight when everybody responds directly to you as the founder, but as the organization scales and you add those levels, the only way forward is to make sure that each leader at each level takes responsibility for that culture to turn it into a high-performing team. So, I've been really lucky in that I've gotten to study that in a variety of different contexts in companies across the globe, from all located together to geographically dispersed, fully remote, et cetera. And then the one thing it actually taught me is in leading my own team, I don't know that I have the patience, the time. I'm doing too many other fun, creative stuff to build it out to where I've got to take that responsibility for it. So kudos to you for knowing to do that ahead of time as you built these different businesses.
Yeah, that's interesting. Why do you think it's so difficult for CEOs to do as the companies grow? So when I sold the largest of the 8 that I built, we had about 540 employees. We had customers in 60 countries. They were aircraft operators. We repaired, overhauled, manufactured aircraft parts. So imagine a large facility that, I think at the end when I sold it, north of 300,000 square feet, where we could build a helicopter from scratch, all the processing, the machining, the inspection, everything in there. And I had 64 different leaders, and I didn't have any issues making that happen, the way I ran at it. And I'm just curious, why is it so hard? When I talk to some leaders, they say we just don't have the discipline to do that, or we don't want to work that hard. What would you say?
Yeah, I think it's two different things. I think for a lot of founders, as they build out a company and everybody still reports to them, let's say it's, a dozen, maybe a dozen and a half people, so you could still keep a very flat hierarchy. The culture tends to just be a group wide replication of that individual founder's culture. So whatever your core values are, those are the ones you end up hiring for, and those are the ones that your people end up replicating, et cetera. It's when you add that next level. If you've done it right, it shouldn't be that difficult when you add one level. But as it grows and moves throughout, it's sort of like the telephone game we all played in fourth grade, right? As you move it from one person, here's my definition of what the behaviors that drive culture are, and then you've got a slightly different version, a slightly different version. So the more levels you have, the more kind of diluted it gets coming down. The other thing that tends to happen is this sort of we call it the mum effect sometimes, minimizing unpleasant messages. So as stuff happens on the front lines, you're, as the senior leader, you're much less likely to feel the full unpleasantness of the message. I'm sure you found this too, right? Like as your organization grows, you have a less clear picture of what's really happening on the front lines, because there's all of these people who need to sort of report it up, and they each can sometimes try and absolve responsibility, et cetera. So it takes a tremendous amount of discipline and, frankly, accountability for behaviors as a senior leader to exhibit that down to the leaders that answer to you, and then make sure they're doing it down. It takes a lot of discipline is the right word for it, accountability, et cetera, to make sure that you actually do that. And candidly, if you ease off that, you don't tend to see it right away in the numbers, right? Culture definitely eats away, a toxic culture eats away at performance, but not right away. In the short term, it can look like, yeah, okay, I'm not doing my check-ins with people as often. I'm not enforcing, certain respect or trust or psychological safety practices all that much. And it doesn't have a big effect right away. It takes 6, 9, almost a year, right, to get to the point where you start to see, oh, we need to make some changes.
I think I'd love to get your take on this. One thing is different about the way I've been doing it over the years is I could in seconds get to every single team on sort of a dashboard and see what their most important number was, which was reflective of the value that team was designed to create. I could see what they were doing in their meetings. I could see the actions they were taking. And I knew in minutes whether they were just checking the box or they
Yeah.
were full leaning in to create value. And I let every other, in the one company I just mentioned with 540 team members, when I sold it, every single employee could see everybody else's team in those same elements
Yeah.
anytime they wanted to. So we knew real time across the board, because I wanted to drive productive collaboration, a lot of the
Right.
stuff that you talk
Right.
about in your books. So
Yeah.
what's your on that? Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a couple things I see in that answer, right? So the first is, again, that accountability. You designed a system where people know what they're going to be held accountable for. They know what that number is. And then I also see a lot of interdependence in that. They can see, even if they're not necessarily holding each other accountable across, which I suspect they probably are, they can still at least see how their work fits into somebody else's work. Candidly, if you have accountability without that interdependence, what can often happen, this has been an organizational and systems thinking theory for a number of years now. What can also often happen is what they sometimes call the myopia of learning, where every team learns what it's being held accountable for, and they learn how to optimize that number. That's the accountability piece for sure. But without that sense of interdependence, they can end up optimizing something that kind of, for lack of a better term, screws over some other team, that cheapens the customer experience, that makes the handoff worse, et cetera, because they're trying to sort of like optimize it. Great example of this is a massive scale example, but like Starbucks, when they were scaling a lot of different locations, this was after Howard Schultz had left, et cetera. They realized we could put all of these coffee drinks out faster if we weren't, hand pouring doing the pull of espresso and all that sort of stuff. So they changed machines, which on its face is helping or holding accountable to much faster turnover numbers, et cetera. The problem is they changed to machines that were so tall, they ruined the line of sight between the barista and the customer, which cheapened the whole overall experience. And no one person sort of catches that, because no one's held accountable to the metric of that. But if you start to see and you look holistically, you can start to see customer satisfaction numbers are dripping, repeat customer numbers are dripping, and eventually trake your way back to that number, which Schultz actually did. He came back. This was, maybe 10 years ago, came back, scrapped the whole machine system, closed every store for an afternoon, and retrained every employee on how to use the old school system where you traditionally pull a shot of espresso to make all of their drinks, right? So you can have that often. You've got accountability systems. That's great. That's like table stakes, but accountability without that sense of interdependence on how it all fits leads to a lot of people operationalizing what they think matters for them and ignoring what happens to the rest of the organization.
Yeah, that's such a great lesson. Small changes can have wildly big, um, impacts, positive or negative, depending. Any advice for organizations at scale that are at scale to think through changes like that? I mean, it seems like such an obvious thing. How did it get missed with a company as capable as Starbucks?
Yeah. So I think number one, I mean, what you did sounds awesome, right? Is making sure that whatever dashboard systems you're using, kind of everybody has access to them and can see what's happening in those other pieces. I think the way that you run a lot of your all hands meetings or huddles, et cetera, can matter too. A lot of organizations will do. So every manager will do some sort of Monday morning or Friday afternoon or just regular weekly meeting, but they don't think about the way they cascade, right? So the idea should be whatever you're doing at those lowest levels, or the value zone, as I like to think of it. Low makes it sound like it's not important, but the truth is it's usually the most important work in that value zone that's interacting with customers or repairing the actual aircraft product, et cetera. In those zones, they're running their meetings and reporting and including what's blocking their progress, what things are potentially limiting them. And then that surfaces up to that next level that runs a huddle. And you can eventually have it filter through over the course of a day or two of these cascading meetings where people really can hear that. That tends not to happen. We tend to actually treat it like reporting down, right? It begins with a Monday morning brief from like that most senior leader. Hey, here's what's important. Here's what we're supposed to focus on. And then people send those messages down. Well, problems don't surface. Tension doesn't surface. Things that are blocking doesn't surface. So I think the actual best way to do is to cascade it the opposite way. I'm thinking about like Alan Mulally during the turnaround of Ford. Their senior leadership meeting happened on Thursday morning. Why? Because it took from Monday through Wednesday to cascade up enough information that they could actually make the best systematic decisions.
Well, that's amazing, and I agree with you. I think you said this: the frontline team members create the most value collectively by far in a company like the aerospace business I described, for sure. And one of the meetings that my favorite day of every single month is an all hands meeting where
Mm.
we get to all 540 team members by function or collections of functions, and they were hour-long meetings, 15 minutes on the business, a safety study of some kind, internal or external, to get those case studies going, and then 45 minutes of them showcasing the best work they're doing to increase the
Mm.
value that they were designed to create. It also helped to where the rumor mill could never go longer than 30 days because you
Yeah.
got whatever questions you wanted. And and it was incredible. And you had a quote. It was something like miscommunication is the illusion that it actually
Yeah,
happened.
the biggest miscommunication, the most dangerous miscommunication is the illusion that communication actually happened. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and no matter how many times I said it, it was even though we had great alignment, people understood the top priorities of the company. Everybody understood that for the most part. It still wasn't to the degree I wanted, and I had to repeat it every
Yeah.
single day. So, what are the challenges there for leaders, and how should they think about it?
Yeah, it's funny. I remember this is completely anecdotal, but it turns out the research kind of backs this up. I remember early on in my own career, I had a leader who told me, like, whatever you need your team to understand, you have to say it twice as loud and twice as often as you think, because they're only going to buy half of what you're saying. Right. So if you want it to get through, you got to say it twice as much as you think you have. Because, and by the way, like that's true in organizations. I also have a 14-year-old and a 12-year-old, both boys. And I think it's super true with them. It's like 4 times as much because they only buy a quarter of what, of what I'm saying. Right. But yeah, there's some interesting research on how people hear, what they're paying attention to, et cetera. But I think the biggest thing is sometimes people need time to process how whatever you're communicating to them is relevant to them. And the first time they hear it, they don't necessarily hear it. Like, ironically enough, you asked about jujitsu. One of the beautiful things about jujitsu is it's a very long struggle to mastery, right? This coming from a sport karate background where you could get a black belt in 3, maybe 5 years long. Jujitsu, it's like 10 years. And most of that time is spent relearning things. When you're a white belt, we teach you like a basic arm bar or how to hold side control, et cetera. Then you become a blue belt and you learn, oh, I'm actually doing this wrong. I need to refine this little thing. And the most common reaction at blue, at purple, at brown, as you move up throughout it is like, oh, I didn't know I've been doing it wrong the whole time. It's like, well, you're not doing it wrong. You just weren't in a position where you could understand everything that was taught to you the first time. Like you missed it because you didn't see its sort of relevance to what you're doing. And now you've been doing this enough, you've got that wider scope. So I'm just telling you the same thing I told you 2 years ago, but you're noticing more about it, right? And I think the same thing happens in organizations, even week by week or day by day, as you reiterate what's most important. Sometimes you just need to kind of chew on it, process the first level of what you're saying, and then when you hear it again, you actually go, "Oh, okay, maybe he also means this, etc." It can definitely tend to happen.
I think being hyper present and curious is just a hard state for a lot of people to be in. And if you,
Yeah.
when you're that way, I think you listen incredibly well and you go deeper and deeper on it. What makes that so hard for most people to get into that state? Because most aren't great listeners. I mean, they're not.
Yeah, well, so I think there's a couple things here. Number one, yeah, we're absolutely, a lot of us are trained on listening for an anchor to build our own next response on, and then we kind of tune out after that instead of waiting to the very end. I coach a lot of leaders, so like, don't say anything when you've got somebody telling you something. Don't, as soon as they're done, you feel like they're done speaking, start asking questions, which I do partly because I want them to share more, right? I want whoever's speaking to that leader to share more, but I also do because if I say all I want you to be thinking of when they're talking is what questions you're going to ask as a follow up, you're not pre-scripting your response and missing those details, right? I think we're just trained a lot of times to try and get our word in, and this is candidly, it's very cultural. That's kind of a very Western North America and Europe kind of thing. You don't see this as much in more collectivistic cultures, et cetera. But so that's number one. I think number two is just we're swimming in a myriad of distractions. I mean, candidly, we got about 5 minutes into this interview, and I realized I forgot to put on Do Not Disturb because somebody was fighting for my attention via my phone. Right? I I flipped it on in such a way that I think nobody noticed. Right, Lee, you didn't notice. If you're listening, you didn't notice, but it definitely happened. Right, and we have that times every communication device that we have. Right, and then I think the biggest fear, what I really liked about what I heard with you too, was that that town hall was every month or so. Because the other thing that can happen is as things get really routine, we just sort of try and tune out in certain places. It's kind of like if you've ever driven the same route to work all the time, you can sometimes pull into the parking lot and be like, how did I get here? I turned my brain off, right? And so if you've got the same format every day, same format every week, et cetera, then you can start to tune out because of the routine of it. So once a month means it's novel every time, even if you're kind of following that same format every time. You'd have to work in that company for a very long time before it feels like routine as opposed to every week, you know?
There was always so much value being created every month. We never ran out of stuff to talk about. We never had enough time to talk about all of it. And one thing I thought was interesting is now meetings are wildly valuable, incredibly important, as long as they're designed to create value. At least that's the way I think about it. But there was so many times where my leadership team would push for, we're just too busy to do this,
Mm,
make twice as many mistakes when we didn't have them. It's
yeah.
like, okay, so never enough time to get it right the first time, but always enough time to get it right the second and third time, which was my joke back then going through it. So talk about that a little bit, the power of meetings and getting it right. And what you said there around just going through the motions. Oh, here we are again and no update today and going through. What a
Yeah.
waste of time. And how can the listeners that are leaders think about structuring meetings to where they really create value and they never get stale?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple things here. I'm trying in my mind to think of, there's a great quote. It actually applies originally to sort of creativity and innovation, but it's essentially you can waste hours by not being able to waste minutes, right? The idea being if you don't have white space in your calendar to daydream and to chat as a team about something, you can end up doing it wrong and then wasting hours because you have to redo it. What we see at least in the research on team meetings and team communication as it parlays into collaboration is partly that waste minutes idea. Believe it or not, high performing teams spend a lot of time socializing, doing free time, what might look like unproductive time. The first 5-10 minutes are really just catching up with each other, and there's a reason for that. There's a level of connection that's built there. New members of the team find things in common with members of the team, so now they feel a little more connected with folks, and much more likely to share, et cetera. You need that time. I actually found this in studying in 2016 and then on through the pandemic. I studied a lot of remote organizations. And one of the things I thought was fascinating was like, if anyone you'd think would be efficient at running a video call, it'd be them. But no, they deliberately have time built into the agenda for that. So that's thing number one. The other thing you tend to see is that they're also very bursty in their communication. And what I mean by that is they come to a lot like your town hall. They come together, they communicate, they get the updates, they put it out there, there's new information to share, and then they're very protective over the time after that. So they may have a slightly longer Monday morning meeting, but they also know no one's going to get called into a meeting Monday afternoon because we reserve that time for white space. Or a lot of them will have rules about maybe it's no meeting Fridays, or maybe it's certain hours of the day or what have you. But they're very, very deliberate about building time where we're not communicating. Right. Candidly, unfortunately, as you go higher up in an organization, you spend more and more of your time in meetings. And that's where you start to get this idea that, like, do these meetings even need to happen? Well, some of them don't, especially if they're not building that white space for people to actually focus. And when you start to actually say, even if it's as small as like, we don't schedule meetings between 2 and 5 so that people can actually finish out their day of what their tasks need to get done, you'd be amazed how much more powerful the meeting times you do have are when people know they can't just call an emergency meeting or call somebody up on the phone. They've got to communicate it in that moment. So there's a whole line of research around this communicating in bursts idea that I think is really, really interesting for a lot of teams. Because you would think the best collaborating, best communicating teams are just in constant sync, and it doesn't seem to be true, at least as it applies to sort of our work. That might, if you look at like a soccer team or a rugby team or something like that, they're probably in constant communication. But when you look at like what we do, no, a lot of them are in that bursty communication.
Yeah. And what percentage of teams, and I guess organizations, all of their team members, are super clear about what's expected of them from a performance standpoint? Like,
I mean,
what do you?
almost it's a single digit number for sure.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, I wish I could give you an exact number. I can give you my anecdotal number is probably in the single digits in my experience of working with a lot of different organizations. I think there are some standout levels of clarity. I will say the other thing that tends to happen is the more an organization, a business model, a company is built around, let's call it knowledge work versus industrial work, right? The harder it is to maintain that standard, right? This is a problem. I mean, Drucker, right, and Charles Handy have been talking about this problem since the 70s and 80s, and I still don't think we've solved it. When the means of production is in the minds of people collaboratively, that can be very messy to actually evaluate. Now, there's certain knowledge work, like sales is a great example. There's certain knowledge work jobs where it's really easy to be like, this is the outcome you're responsible for. But on the marketing side, like, how do we judge whether or not a new brand campaign was fantastic until 18 months down the road when we have good enough numbers to look at ROI, et cetera? It's really hard to do. In a more industrial work, it's a lot easier to build those accountability systems in. And so that's where I think, and what I loved about your definition of culture being that sort of set of behaviors, et cetera, is I think the only thing you can do in that knowledge work scenario is hold people accountable to the behaviors that are the predictors of performance, right? Hold people accountable to exhibiting and doing the things lead to that number, because those are the only things you can kind of observe in the moment.
Yeah. Well, what I've been doing, and I haven't been stumped yet on it, is for every single role to come up with what I'm calling OCDs. It's kind of funny to say it that way, but it's outcomes held accountable to, capabilities needed to have a shot at achieving the outcomes, and then duties, job duties that they're responsible for. A lot of, sometimes administrative things that, we don't want to make the time for, but it's still part of the job.
Yeah.
So I go through those OCDs, and if it comes to marketing, at the end of the day, and there's so many different types of companies out there, but marketing is about generating qualified leads, and qualified leads should have a very clear definition, like percent closing ratio, ideal personas, all that come in. And somebody could run a marketing campaign. Well, we won't know for 18 months. Well, I'm not going to set that your job in the marketing department, for example, is to generate qualified leads. And this is just part of it. And if you're not hitting that number on an ongoing basis to support what we need, then we need to revisit it. So I've taken that OCD approach with every single role. It doesn't matter whether it's
Yeah.
accounting, engineering, and it works. It just works. And it's never more than three. One's better.
Mm.
Two's a little
Interesting.
better in terms of the
And
outcomes. It's all measurable.
and then how are you building out incentive compensation, right? And bonuses and that sort of stuff? Is it still very individual, or has it become sort of team based, right? Because I think about, we'll use the marketing example, and the job of a marketing department is to generate qualified leads. Yes, but that's like the job of the entire marketing team, right? And so do we bonus out on tie that incentive to the team-based bonus of the marketing department, or do we still tie it back into those individual performance reviews and things?
I think I'm older than you, but do you remember the Philip Crosby quality concept back in the day? I don't know if you remember that.
No.
I got certified to do it as an organization. I was trained the trainer, like all of it. And there's this whole new language. And we had all these individual incentive programs. And it got to where I was wasting half of my day dealing with the dysfunction that came out of those individual incentive programs.
Hmm.
So I just went with what I call the PC, performance comp program. And I said, look, if payroll's $1 million and the bonus amount is for a month, the bonus amount is $100,000. Doesn't matter whether you made $10 an hour or $300,000 a year, you got 10% because it was a percentage
Mm.
of payroll. Now
Yeah.
everybody's incentivized to help everybody else earn another dollar for the business, which
Yeah.
helped their business. They were better at peer surveillance, letting better people through the door on the recruiting side, and all that noise went away. It
Yeah.
just completely went. It was beautiful, and I've
Yeah. So,
never there is a downside, which is somebody can just ride the coattails of everybody else. They can, what's that, road warrior, retired and active duty concept, but
right.
that's way easier to deal with and identify than the dysfunction of all the individual programs.
Well, especially if you've got OCDs where there's one, two, possibly three things they're being held accountable for, et cetera. Yeah. When you were explaining that to me, the whole thing going on in my mind is like, it sounds like it would work a whole lot better with sort of that team-based incentives. And that's exactly what you see, by the way, in the research across a number of different companies. I think Wageman, I think, is the name of the person who started finding this in like the 1990s, was that essentially if you've got very individualistic tasks and you do your incentives individualistically, sales is a great example again here, like that can work great. If you've got very collaborative tasks, very interdependent work, and then your bonuses and your incentive compensation are group oriented, like everybody gets 10% if we're 10% above our target, that works really, really well. Unfortunately, where most companies fit is actually in that middle, where we've got everything is interdependent, and yet we're still going to use things like your manager's performance evaluation of you once a year to determine what your sort of bonus is and that sort of stuff. So your rewards are individualistic, and that creates that myopia that we were talking about earlier, because people are just sort of thinking about themselves. How can I game that number? All of that sort of stuff. So yeah, everything you said makes perfect sense. As soon as I was like, are you bonusing individually or team-wise? Because the team-wide incentive in that scenario seems like it works brilliantly most of the time.
Yeah, you said so much there. It's interesting to me. I think every organization is a value creation machine. We're all working together, and there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of interdependencies. We should performance comp that way. That's what I believe. And one of the ways that I supported that, you have to teach them the math. They have to understand the basics of what that looks like. I would give every single employee, and I've done it in all my businesses, a complete set of the financials every single month. And if they don't understand debits and credit, we would produce a plain English detailed trial balance for their part of the business, so they could see how many rolls of tape did we use, how many nails did we use, whatever that is. They could look at it and go, oh my gosh, we didn't need to spend that much, and they would make changes over there.
Yeah.
And then if everybody's clear about what's expected and they know where they stand 100% of the time, the performance review of old is obsolete.
Yeah.
I do something called a performance snapshot, where the entire team gives feedback around what they're doing really well and opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
And that works incredibly well when you go through it. Even in cultures where they're afraid to have those conversations, the first time you do it, it's better than anything they've ever done before. Why does that work?
Yeah. So again, you've got that interdependence thing going on there, right? I think there's also the funny thing you said is, even if it doesn't work the first time, et cetera, it creates, in my thought, it creates a regular experience that requires the team to build out the sense of psychological safety, which is something we dive into in the book a ton, right? Which is not safe spaces, everyone feeling like, hey, no matter how you're doing great, you're amazing. Right? It's actually, when there's disagreements, when there's dysfunction, when there's problems, I feel like I am not going to, we're not going to shoot the messenger, that I can speak what I'm actually thinking, point out those things, et cetera. And so it sounds like the thing that I key in on a ritual like that is that it in order to work, it requires psychological safety, and it also creates, as if you're a new member of the organization, you may be coming into that team doing that ritual, and you're probably self-censoring a bit at first. You're not wanting to show up. You're carrying baggage from a different company with you into that new company. But as you start to see it, it builds that bigger and bigger. There's a concept. It's actually since I came out from the book that I talk about this concept of trust being reciprocal much more often. You need to do these turns of the trust loop, as I call it, where people need to take that risk, be met with respect. Thank you for that candor feedback. Here's how we're going to act on it, et cetera. And you need to see that click multiple times before you try it yourself. And then you need to try it and have a leader who responds with that respect and appreciation for your candor and acts on that feedback, et cetera. You need to have that click a few times before it really sort of gels. And so doing that in as a part of a regular meeting is probably what's building that up to where, yeah, now we've got a whole organization where people feel like they can point out what's wrong much faster than in most organizations.
Yeah. When I heard you talk about that in one of your interviews, it made me think a lot deeper about trust and respect, and all of that stuff within an organization. So I've had situations where everybody trusts me because I'm super consistent, but a number of those folks I don't trust to do what they said they'll do because they regularly
Yeah.
don't do all of it. So when you say reciprocal, I think that's the only way. It has to be reciprocal to be able to do the next level of creating value within a
Yeah.
team.
Yeah.
So thank you for helping me think more deeply about that. But am I on the right track here?
Yeah, you are. I think it's worth. This is a flaw in the English language, if I may. I think it's worth putting a pause and going. When Americans especially, but in the West and in English, when we use the word trust, there's actually sort of two types of trust, and we use the word simultaneously, or we use the same word to describe both. The first, that consistency thing, that's what we might call performance trust or cognition based trust, or basically trust in you are going to do what you say you're going to do. You're capable enough. You have the knowledge, skills, and abilities to do it. Right. I trust that you can do it. I'm a Philadelphia Eagles fan. I trust that Jalen Hurts can get it done, although he has given me evidence sometimes that maybe he can't, right? So that is like, Rachel Botsman has a great definition of that level of trust, which is a confident relationship with the unknown. When I don't know what the outcome is, I can put my trust in that person and now be confident that I can predict the outcome because they've been so consistent over time, right? So that's trust type one. Trust type two is what sometimes the research is called affect-based trust or vulnerability. It's a willingness to be vulnerable, right? Which is totally, in my mind, I feel like at some point we're going to have to come up with a different word for that, right? Because it's less about, and they are intermixed, but it's less about, hey, I know that Lee's always going to operate this way. It's more like, hey, I know, and it comes through consistency, but hey, I know I can speak my mind here and actually be appreciated for it because I've been vulnerable in the past. I can be vulnerable in that, take that risk or that leap and say it. And so those things build a little bit differently. This one builds consistently over time, but can be one way in that I can always trust you, but you might not trust me because of past ones. This one sort of requires that reciprocal. I've yet to find a dyad, a team, a pair of people where that affect-based trust doesn't go both ways. If I can be vulnerable with you, you can be vulnerable with me. If I have candor with you, you have candor with me. The other way, it can actually be not reciprocal, right? I can know that I have taken the time to build, especially if you have a new employee, et cetera. It does take time to build that. And the goal is to get it to the point where both people have that level of trust with each other. But it may not build in perfect synchrony because consistency is that key on that.
And it can take a minute to kind of bust through a confirmation bias of a new employee coming in that's just been in terrible environments, before.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Employees take their baggage with them from one organization to another. And sometimes you can have the best leader out there and it still takes a while to get that person to go, no, things really are different here.
So you're probably going to come after me hard on this one. Let me tell you a story.
Yeah, go for it.
It was a long time ago I started doing this, and I really liked it. For me, organizational trust, because there's so many interdependencies, is if I give this person something to do, will they get it done when they said they would? And if not, they'll let me know long before so I can make adjustments.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would sit down. I probably had about 12 leaders in the organization when I started doing this. I said, we're going to do an organizational trust exercise on a scale from 1 to 5. 5, super high organizational trust. That individual always does what they say they will. 1, they virtually never do. And I went around, we all rated everybody at the table openly that way. And it was it was the craziest response afterwards. Like, I can't believe you did that. This is so But then, we were really good at going for it. We came to work every day. We knew the value we wanted to create collectively. And I would just make the point that we depend on each other, and you may have another priority. It was never, I'm not doing because I don't want to. It's because I think this is a higher priority. What they would forget is that what they committed to with all these interdependencies, their higher priority could have taken value out of the company compared to what
Right.
otherwise could have been created. But we would do that exercise and regularly do it. And lo and behold, people started doing what they said they would a much higher percentage of the time.
Yeah. I don't have a problem with that. It actually reminds me a lot of sort of Ray Dalio in the early days of Bridgewater, where there was sort of that dashboard of constant 360 feedback where people can kind of see. I mean, I think the biggest detrimental effect of a rapidly scaling organization or of any large organization is that people tend to optimize for what they're going to be individually rated on and don't think about how that affects other folks. And the easiest way to solve that is to hear how you're doing from the very people who depend on your performance, right? That true 360 feedback system. And I think it works more painfully and it works slower when it's non-anonymous. Like, I didn't realize you and I both just upset every HR professional in the world by saying that, right? But it does actually work better, not because you need to know the person who said it, but because you need to know the role. You need to understand that this person from this department who has this responsibility is potentially giving me that constructive feedback. And I may not have been aware until that moment that my performance cascades and affects her performance, right? And so names or at least functions, et cetera, I think matter tremendously for that.
Yeah. And I always divided the HR function into two pieces. There's the employee relationship, which I always feel should be owned by leadership.
Hmm.
And then
Yeah.
there's the support, which is, payroll benefits, that kind of stuff. And I always looked at myself, even with hundreds of employees, I'm the head of HR. I've got a team handling the benefits and payroll. But if an employee had an issue, they would take it to their leader and they could skip it all the way to me if they wanted to. So after all of this time, I never once have had a leader quit on their own, ever. I
Hmm.
had to ask you to leave and never once had an EEOC claim or an employee lawsuit, ever. And I can't think of another company that can say that.
Yeah.
And CEOs, they hire somebody for HR to own all of that stuff, and it goes sideways fast in my experience. So yes,
Yeah.
most HR professionals don't like me too much when I talk
Yeah.
this way.
Well, and you're starting to see this in large and multinational companies where there's sort of a split, and HR has inherited that benefits and support function, and then there's another, either it's organizational development or talent development or something like that is primarily concerned with equipping leaders at every level for the things they need to do that, right? I firmly believe culture. There's no such thing as company culture. There's just the average of each individual team culture you have, right? And so when you're one team that is one boss, the average is the same thing as that team's culture. But as in a large organization, you got a lot of work to do there. So you're starting to kind of see that. I think the thing is that's interesting though is still structurally, you don't see it all that often. I was actually just speaking at a summit of a lot of different HR professionals, and still it's incredibly common for the HR function to answer up into the CFO function, and for the OD function to not really know who answers to them. Instead of like the OD function, the one responsible for equipping leaders throughout a multinational organization should still probably have a direct line to that CEO because it matters that much.
Yeah, I'm 100% aligned. The three elements that you talk about in your book, best team ever, that cause or create, building these amazing teams: the common understanding, psychological safety, and social purpose. It was interesting how, with all the success that I've had, we actually did all that stuff and long before I met you or read your book. But I think it's just a natural thing to do. But the psychological safety piece of it, like being in your book, you talk about a hospital example.
Hmm.
Higher performing teams are reporting more. They must be worse. No, they're not. My challenge was getting people to report every single thing that went wrong, so nothing ever got out the back door, because lives depended on
Right.
our stuff working well when you bolted on a 747 or a helicopter. Talk about that a little bit and the importance of it, and more instances is actually a good thing. I love that example in the book.
Yeah. So this is one of my favorite studies of all time, from Amy Edmondson, who was the original sort of person that coined this concept of team-wide psychological safety. Fun fact about this one, actually. I've known Amy for a number of years now. This was part of a part of her original doctoral dissertation research. And when she first saw the data set, she thought like, oh no, I've got to scrap this whole thing and start over because this is so weird. Essentially what was happening is Amy was studying teams of nurses inside of two different hospitals in the Boston area. My wife's an ER physician. So like this, probably the other reason I love this study. In any hospital, you've got different wards, intensive care and labor and delivery and, surgery, trauma, blah, blah, blah. And then in each of those wards, you have a shift of nurses, let's say 12 hours or 8 hours, what have you. And then every shift has a charge nurse, the nurse in charge of that shift of nurses. Should be a super easy study. Amy just gave a bunch of different leadership inventories and culture inventories to all of the nurses across the hospital and then tried to break it down by who was their assigned shift, their assigned charge nurse, and then how do we correlate that to performance metrics. And on most of the performance metrics, it worked great. So this is everything from patient satisfaction scores, readmittance rates, right? Because if people come back within 3 days, usually that means we didn't actually help them, right? All of these different numbers, complication rates and what have you. And the weirdest one was that in the highest performing teams by all of those other metrics and the teams of the highest performing leaders, the numbers said they had more accidents. They had a higher rate of reported accidents. And it wasn't until Amy and the team that was researching this started sitting in on the meetings that they figured out what was happening is that word reported carries an awful lot of work, right? What was happening was the actual error rates were roughly the same. But what can happen far too often in any team or in any organization without enough psychological safety is somebody makes a mistake, they fix the mistake, and then they think, okay, no harm, no foul, like it's fixed. There's no need to report this. The problem, well, first of all, in medicine, and probably the same thing in aircraft maintenance, like massively unethical, right? Like you're putting lives at risk by doing that. The other problem is that psychological safety is sets the precedent for a team-wide growth mindset or for organizational learning. If you're not saying, hey, I made this mistake, if you're not creating that environment where that can happen, well, you're not having a team-wide conversation about, okay, why? What triggered that? Were you overloaded? Were the two different bottles of medication the exact same color and sitting right next to each other? Like what changes in the system can we make that will make sure that mistake doesn't happen more often? And so I think the same thing throughout most organizations, right? Is you have people who think, I mean, it's hard. It's hard to admit that you failed, right? And when you have a leader who is like you were saying earlier about, we ended up wasting way more time trying to fix this stuff. So wait, we have 3 hours to fix it, but we didn't have 1 hour to do it right in the first place. Unfortunately, like that's a positive response, but a lot of leaders just go, oh, I can't believe we have to fix this again. And the way that you respond sends this message that like, oh, well, okay, they're going to flip out. So what if I just fix it quietly? Well, fixing it quietly doesn't change or improve the system. And this goes because you mentioned the quality. My quality, godfather is W. Edward Deming, who I'm sure is similar in that similar vein and related. And he always talks about in the Toyota production system, the Andon cord, the idea that anybody at any point in the line of production of the car can pull a red cord and stop the whole line. Because if they see a problem, it's usually a systematic problem. Candidly, one of the weirdest things about studying the relationship between culture and high performance is that you have to admit that it's not, at a certain point, you have to admit it's not just culture, it's also systems. But if you don't create a culture where people say, let's change the system every time a mistake happens, you don't end up building out that systems level. So I guess it's still culture. The point is we have to build a culture where people feel like they can report those mistakes so that over the long term, the mistakes go down so that you don't repeat the same mistake over and over and over again. But the fact that you're vocal about it in the short term is actually a good thing. And I think a lot of leaders can get messed up in that and think I just need to manage the number of mistakes, et cetera. You don't. You need to measure the learning, and mistakes are a great indicator of whether or not learning is actually happening.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of times it's a system or process challenge. So bring it up so we can address that so it actually never happens again. At least that's what I experience. But yeah, if they would fix it and not tell anybody, that means it could happen again, could get out the door, and could cause a failure. But doing it right, we had well over 100 million flight hours on our parts and never one single in-service failure. knock on wood, that was just incredible.
That's great.
Um,
Yeah.
have so common understanding and social purpose. I love the pro social purpose piece of it, and I've always had that built into everything that I do, even if it's we are supporting all these families. This is so cool, and we get to work with people. Doesn't
Yeah.
matter how sexy like when a CEO says, "It just isn't that sexy of a business, not that interesting," or whatever. What are you talking about? You get to work with people, and you're supporting all these families. This is incredible. How do you address that?
Yeah. So a couple of different thoughts, and we, we hit common understanding a ton, and that interdependence, what have you. That's the secret sauce of it. So I think as a leader, what do you focus on next? That pro social purpose is huge. This is exactly that. So pro social purpose, I'm kind of combining a couple different spheres of research in this term. We know purpose is important. Simon Sinek did everyone a favor 15 years ago by saying, "Hey, start with why." It just turns out that when you look at the research, for most people, humans are social creatures who were designed or evolved to exist in much smaller social circles than they exist in now. Most of us feel a sense of purpose by who, not necessarily why. Not a vague, this is our mission statement, but who's actually impacted by our work. And then there's another whole stream of research as a leader. I think this is huge. That suggests that employees respond way more favorably when they are in communication with one of those beneficiaries than when they're just hearing about it from a leader. So, in essence, you can capture and tell these stories, but an even better approach is how do you bring those stories in? Now, that who, though, I think is a really interesting one because it's really tempting to go, okay, here's our mission statement, our vision, our values. Here's who we serve. We serve the aircraft companies, the pilots, whomever it is, et cetera. And just leave it at that. But the truth is, once you've got a very large organization, a lot of teams that are properly aligned, their who is actually somebody else in the company, somebody else down the line. Like we were talking about earlier about the HR function, right? There's that support function that makes sure benefits and incentive time and payroll goes out. Their who isn't the pilot, isn't the aircraft company, isn't even the passenger on the plane, right? I mean, it is down the line, but their direct who is the exact people they're serving, right? The exact number of employees. So what I think is for most leaders at each level, you need to start. I literally was about to say you need to start with why, which I guess means it's a great book. You do need to start with that mission, the vision, the value statement, but then every team has to have a conversation about, hey, aligned with this overarching organizational purpose, where do we fit in and who is our closest, who is served by that? And then we could talk about how the chain of events leads to that end goal. But for a lot of people, it's other folks inside the organization. We're in this together. The whole reason we exist as an organization is this cannot be done alone. If it could, we probably would have found enough other contractors or vendors to outsource it all out and brought it back to the core of people who could. So that who is still ever present. But every leader at every level needs to have that conversation about that who is served idea. By the way, this is also what I really, really like about your thing you were saying earlier on the dashboard and the other metrics, et cetera, is all of these concepts. These are common understanding, psychological safety, pro-social purpose. These are not independent concepts. They're interdependent. And the through line through them is, again, that idea of us as an organization being interdependent.
Yeah. In the way it would manifest for me, so I couldn't articulate it early on, but then I got to where I could really articulate it. And when I think about creating value, it has to be holistic to feel right and sustain. And so material money is always important, EBITDA, cash flow, if we're going to sell a business someday or just survive, weather the storms, for example. But the emotional energy piece of it, I think, is the scarcest commodity on the planet. And it supercharges everything we do when it's running a 9 or 10 on a scale from 1 to 10. And then the spiritual value creation in the business context, I always thought about connection. So in one example, I put in a 10,000 square foot gym. All the team members are training with each other in classes with functional movement certified trainers. Out of 540 team members, close to 400 are qualified for the program. I got more money for doing that. We would weave in causes. I rescued an animal rescue, and for probably 4.5 months straight, I had 30 plus of my team members driving to New Mexico building compounds for these animals. So we did this stuff, and every weekend there are like 15 barbecues that you were invited to. It was amazing, and it was just how we sort of breathe. But I don't see a lot of companies doing this very intentionally. Like they talk about it, they say, "Hey, and I have the 4 things or the 3 things from, Dr. Burkus, for example," and yet they're not very good at putting it in place. there's something about the almost infinitely or infinite number of nuanced ways to navigate going down a road when you have all these people that are different. So trying to ask the question in the right way, it can't be the three things or the 12 questions, or we have to do a survey to see how the company's doing. How can leaders show up to where they can be going in that direction and creating more and more value over time rather than trying to have a cookie cutter recipe approach?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think your connection word is a good one as a foundation, as a starting journey, right? Is making sure that people actually feel in an organization, on a team, feel connected to each other, and then connected into that larger organizational purpose. If you start there, like, hey, my job as a leader isn't just to hold people accountable to whatever metric our team is being held accountable to, but also to demonstrate how this is connected to everything else. That then tends to sort of surface what are your problems, right? Candidly, I see that connection as inside of this idea of common understanding. Do people know what's expected of them, how it fits into the whole? Do they have an appreciation for each other's differences, different personalities, work preferences, functions, et cetera, right? But if you can't build that, it could point at the fact that what's actually missing is that sense of psychological safety, right? And so as a leader, okay, that's the one I need to start through. Or as you're trying to build that connection, you find that the mechanism to do that may be that sense of pro-social purpose. We're all sort of in this together. Let's find a cause, whether it's an animal shelter or whatever it is. So I think if you start with that idea that my primary job as a leader is not just to hold people accountable to a standard, but to show how that standard is connected to the broader system, I think you'll be able to start diagnosing where those different problems are that need to be fixed. I mean, the favorite thing that I heard from you say today was these are practices that we'd been doing in business before I even met you and read your book, but they just seem sort of intuitive. You're totally right. There's nothing new about it. And there's some fun new studies and great new case studies in my book, but it's a bit like I think it's Tolstoy. Is it Anna Karenina? There's a famous piece of literature that says all starts with all happy families are alike, and every unhappy family is unhappy in its own unique way. Teams are pretty similar. Organizations are pretty similar, right? High performing, highly engaging organizations are unfortunately still rare. Gallup says across the globe, it's about 19% engagement, right? And that's down a couple points from the highest ever, which was like 22. That's depressing, right? But I would promise you, as you start to look into those organizations, most of them, they may do very, very different things. They may on the surface have different core value statements and believe it, but they're very, very alike in terms of the behaviors that build it. And they stem from those three. So start with that sense of connection and then follow your intuition on what you feel like that's leading you into where your team lacks and start building on that. There's no start here, then build this, then build this. It's really just a matter of, as I'm trying to connect everybody into that greater purpose and into each other and how we're interdependent, one of those levers probably needs to be pulled more strongly than the other, but it's up to each individual manager to know which one it is.
Yeah, I love that. With all the stuff going on out there around lack of employee engagement, low performance, going with it. And it seems like when it's explained, it's always the company's fault. They didn't get something right about the culture or something else. I think we're in a crisis of integrity because an employee takes the job, the company pays them 100% of what they agree to. They're keeping their word. And then the employee gets to decide to only give 50 or less percent of what they agreed to because the culture isn't what they thought it should be. That seems like a crisis of integrity to me. So I always hold everybody accountable to the outcomes they agreed to, and I
Yeah.
100% myself accountable to paying them. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with you. I think there's a whole concept called equity theory that's been around for about 30 years that is essentially that. Like we as humans, our default bias is to constantly adjust the performance we think we're giving to the reward we think we're getting, and if it falls out of sync or what have you. Really, so yes, there's an integrity issue there, but I think it also goes back to systems. If we created a system where you can coast, if we created a system where what is the line in Office Space where like you can only make me do just enough to not get fired? Well, there's a problem, right, in the system then, because just enough to not get fired, maybe it should be all of those things we said we were not right away. It's not like in the first week we notice a dip in performance, so you're out, right? But we tend to drag our feet on performance improvement interventions. We tend to drag our feet on all that stuff, and employees can sort of learn, hey, wait a minute, there is what I signed on for, but then there's a lower standard that if I meet that lower standard, I won't be fired. And then equity theory and our biases tune in, by the way, and we start to think that we are meeting that max standard because we're still here, right? And so I see a lot of it as a systems and accountability issue, one that usually has to be solved on that individual manager level, not a organizational HR level.
Yeah. And I agree with all that. I think both sides should do their job. And I always thought of it, it's just part of human nature that a large percentage will drift to the path of least resistance.
Hmm.
But there's a small percentage that just go for it. They come in, they want to just run. When you have high performers, what do they want in your experience? We have a lot of time left here, and I've got 80 more questions I wanted to ask you.
We'll just have to do a round two in a year or something like that.
Okay.
What do high performers want? High performers fundamentally, I think the two things to focus on: pay them enough to take the issue of pay off the table. That's for everyone listening who's like, oh, I'm a high performer and I don't get paid enough. I hear you. Pay them enough to take the issue of pay off the table, and then make sure that they know that their contribution is visible. I think the easiest way to disengage one of those people who comes in and they really are all in and they really are a high performer is to make them feel like their top level contribution isn't getting noticed, isn't getting seen, right? Not even, again, rewarded is just the compensation piece, but that I'm actually making a contribution toward work that benefits others. And you see that. You see that I am one of those people and I'm not just like everybody else. That's usually the easiest way. The lack of that is the easiest way to get a high performer disengaged.
That is such great advice. And I also love the quote, the talent doesn't make the team makes the talent. I've experienced that many times.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, I'm a Philadelphia Eagles fan, right? So there are times where our team culture gets us to the Super Bowl, and then you could take the exact same players and swap in a different coach with a different culture, and the whole thing falls apart, and everybody's screaming at each other. I mean, I think, unfortunately, you don't have to work in an adult real world job very long before you notice that a bad team culture will destroy a high performer every single time.
Yeah. And the CEO really drives it. One of my business partners before he passed was Jack Welch in my consulting company, ETW. And it was fun having all those conversations, but watching him pass the torch when he left and how quickly things declined and all the value that was destroyed coming out of it. It's amazing. Even in an organization with 400,000 plus team members, it can happen just like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
David, this has been fantastic. I've learned so much from you before the interview going through this. If our listeners want to learn more about your work and connect with you, how can they do that?
Yeah. Well, so if you've made it this far, you're part of a very, very special group of these listeners called the End of the Podcast Club, right? You've listened to the entire interview. So you probably, if you're already in there, you probably already know that the single best place he wants to send you is the show notes for this episode, whether that's swiping up or over or clicking the description and video, whatever it is, and all the links you're going to need there. If you're like driving or running, please don't stop and do that. You're really lucky. My name's really weird. Burkus is a very unique name. If you just guess at how it's spelled when you type it into Google, and you'll probably find me on whatever platform you want to interact with. And I hope you do. And I hope you continue to interact. This is not a conversation that unfortunately, we didn't solve everything today. And so this is a conversation that will have to keep going. And if you're listening to this and you want to keep the conversation going, come find me.
David, thank you again. I'm sure our listeners got a ton of value out of this.
Oh, again, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. And this has been the Show Your Value podcast. If you got some value out of today's episode, please like and subscribe. And until next time, show your value to the world.